Let us trust today that through God's Word, His grace and His peace will fill us. How important is water to life? They say that you can go maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks without food, but only about 3 days without drinkable water. During the Exodus journey, when the Hebrew children were in the land between being in bondage to Egypt and being in the promised land, at least 3 times there was a lack of water that led to a crisis of trust because they were thirsty. Let's think about what it means to be in the land between. In the land between, you are between where you were in life, a place, a season, a situation in your life, but you're not yet to the new place. What'll be the new normal or the new place in your life. And when you're in the land between, a lot of questions come up. And it can be a challenging place. I want you to think about a time when you have been in the land between in your life. And you've had questions. When I look back over my life, I think of a number of times when I've been in the land between. When I was a young man and I had my heart broken. When I went away after college and I didn't know what was going to happen after that. When I've lost someone who was dear to me and that grief experience of not knowing what life was going to be like after that. When I've moved in my life, like when I moved to Gehenna, 20 years ago. That was a season of being in the land between. When we go through health crises, and we're not sure what life is going to be like now. When I had my heart attack a number of years ago, that was definitely a land of questions. And even now, at 63 years old, I wonder, there's going to be a next season of life at some point in my life, and that'll feel like a land between. What about you? When have you been in a land between? And because of that, being in a land of questions, sometimes troubling questions. We have those questions when we're in this experience of the land of questions, like, what's going to happen to me? Where will I be? And sometimes those questions can deepen to tougher questions like, why? Why is this happening to me? Or how long will this be happening to me? Questions you see often in the Bible. I think those are questions I have right now as we're in the midst of this 2020. Because the pandemic, because of the social unrest due to our greater awareness of racial inequity, because of the economic downturn that's taken place, because of the conflictual election that is upon us and the discord that's in our society. I don't know about you, but this is tough. In fact, I'd have to say, as a pastor of a church, this has been one of the most difficult times to be in leadership in a parish, because we still don't know what it's going to be like for us, and things have changed. When we're in the land between, we're also in the land of questions. And the results of that can be this. Our trust can be shaken. Our trust may be in God or in others. Our trust in institutions or situations that we had grown accustomed to and trusted. Our trust in ourselves can be shaken. And sometimes the results can also be that we are more likely to make poor decisions as we grasp for a quick fix. So, what do we look for when we are in the land between? When we're in the land of questions? What do we thirst for in those times? I think we thirst for signs of assurance that all will be well. It's like we're saying to God, are you still with me? Can you show me some sign that gives me the assurance that all will be well as I struggle with these questions in the land between? And it's so hard when that sign doesn't seem to come, or maybe it even gets worse that's such a difficult place to be. So let's learn from the experience of the Hebrew children when they were in the wilderness, in the land between, kind of a desert experience, of how they faced that, and maybe learn from their poor example, their poor decisions, or what they did well, for when we are also in the land between, in the land of questions. Let's learn from the experience of the Hebrew children on their Exodus journey in the land between, and let's do that in a creative way. Let's look at it from a survival point of view and see how God over and over again met their survival needs when they are in the land between, in the land of questions. If you've taken a survival course, you've learned what are the top priorities if you're in a wilderness setting and you need to survive. First, you need to attend to medical needs. If someone's not breathing, they have 3 minutes. You want to signal for help that you're lost and in need of help. You want to find shelter if you're in an adverse environment because you may have only 3 hours. Within 3 days, you want to find water, and within 3 weeks, food. That's what you learn in a survival course. Now let's apply that to the Exodus journey. They didn't really have medical needs. God had made them a strong people. Even though they were in bondage, they were able to walk out of bondage in Egypt. We see that in chapter 13 of Exodus. Also in chapter 13, we see that God provided for them a signal of help. When they were lost, God provided a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to guide them. A few weeks ago, Aaron described the story of God provided shelter for them when Pharaoh's army was bearing down upon them at the Red Sea, and God parted the Red Sea, providing them the shelter of that escape so they could be safe. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Mike talked about their need for water, and they were thirsty, and they found some water, but it was bitter. But God made that water sweet so it could nourish them. Last week, Pastor Mike talked about chapter 16 of Exodus, where God provided food for them in the wilderness. Over and over again, God provided for the survival needs of the Hebrew people in the land between, the land of questions, giving them signs of assurance. Now we see recorded in Exodus 17 that again there's a lack of water that is causing a crisis of trust. They're out in the barren desert, the sun is beating down on them, and there's no water, and they're dying of thirst. People have become completely exasperated with the leadership of Moses. And you know, their journey has just begun. They're just at the start of it. There's still a long way to go, and already they're at their limit. And Moses says to them in verse 2, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put God to the test?" And they respond by saying, "Why did you bring us out into this barren desert to die of thirst, ourselves, our children, and our cattle?" Again, those troubling questions of why when we're in the land between, in the land of questions. So Moses cries out to God. And now he's not just concerned for the people, he's concerned for himself, because they want to put him to death. They want to assassinate him. Once again, people are pushed to the limit, and God has not yet given a sign of assurance out in the land between, in that barren land. Have you been there? Have you been pushed to your limit? And it seems that God has not yet given you a sign of assurance, and you're saying, "Where are you, God?" Even if you don't believe in God, you're having those same questions. And first, let me say, we're glad you're with us. We think it's important for you to be with us because we have those same questions. But you're asking, where's the life that I thought I had? Why life isn't this happening? Where are you, life that I had? We're asking the same questions, saying to God, why? These are the more difficult questions we face in the land of questions, in the land between. Are you there, God? Are you there, life? And let me explain to you why this was particularly difficult for the Hebrew children in the land between when they were in the desert. One of the reasons why having a lack of water was such a shock to the Hebrew children in the land of between and raised so many questions for them is because it was in such contrast to what they had experienced. Even though they were in bondage in Egypt, and it was a very difficult experience, they were in the delta of the Nile River, where there was 90 miles of delta and 150 miles of shoreline, one of the most fertile pieces of ground on the planet. It's why Egypt was one of the bread baskets of antiquity. And you see this in the opening chapters of the book of Exodus, where water is referred to a number of times. Remember, Moses was found in a basket floating in the river. When Pharaoh went down for his daily bath in the river, that was one of the occasions for one of the plagues. In fact, a number of the plagues rose out of water. So there was an abundance of water where they had lived. And then also this. They had experienced God's control over water in the plagues, in the crossing of the Red Sea. So when you put an abundance of water in their recent experience, with their experience that God was in control of water, it led them to have a sense of security when it came to hydration. Even though if you'd been kind of a wise-aleck teenager going with them on the Exodus journey and you said, hey, we're going out into the desert, is there going to be water for us there? The answer would have been, of course there's going to be. And that's why it was so shocking when at least 3 occasions they felt they were dying of thirst and questions arose. Why? Why is this happening? This is how life often is in the land between. We have times of abundance when we have periods of feasts and fountains, and life is like a fountain gushing out with all kinds of wonderful experiences, and we have the assurance that all is well. But when we are in the land of famine, of thirst, of ongoing disappointment, when we feel like we're in this barren desert of questions, tough questions arise. What happens inside of us when something that really matters to you is not given to you, or worse, taken away? Questions arise, and we are thirsting for signs of assurance from somebody, from God, from life, from people around us. And maybe we want to put God to the test and say, show us, God, that you are with us. Give us a sign of assurance. When the people asked God for a sign of assurance, he gave them a dramatic sign of assurance, the sign that was needed. He told Moses to go out before all the people and take the leaders of the people and take in his hand the staff in which Moses had struck the Nile at the time of the plagues, and go to the rock and strike it. And he said, I will be there. And God was, and water came out, and the people were nourished of their thirst. God sometimes gives signs when we thirst for reassurance, and our trust increases. When that happens, we need to rehearse it. We need to remember, say, remember when God did this. Now there's a third account of when the lack of water caused a crisis of trust on the Exodus journey. It happens at the very end of the journey. So this is like 40 years later after those first crises from the lack of water. They're right at the edge of the promised land. And again, they run out of water. And they grumble and quarrel with Moses and say, why have you led us out here to die? We wish we had died with our kinsmen out in the desert like some of them did. And so Moses goes before God, and God says, hey, take your staff and go to that rock. It's a different rock this time. And speak to the rock. And water will gush out of the rock. And so Moses, in a dramatic way, gathers all the people. And he says, listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of the rock? And he goes to the rock, And instead of just speaking to it, he strikes it once. Nothing happens. So he strikes it again. And then water comes out of the rock. And they're all given water to drink. Their children, their animals. And yet something happens there that's really important. You see, Moses didn't trust God. He didn't just speak to the rock. He had to strike it in a dramatic way, as though that was causing water to come out of the rock. And because of this, God said to Moses, "You are not going to lead the people into the promised land." After all these years of leading the people to the promised land, Moses wasn't going to be allowed. So what does all this mean for us in August 2020? Well, let's all admit we are in a land between, where we are thirsting for questions, where our trust can sometimes be eroded because of all we're facing. So know this: God sometimes gives signs of reassurance when we're in the land of questions. Look for those signs. Of all the prayers I've prayed over my years, the vast majority of them, God has answered yes. God gives signs of reassurance when we're in the land between, in the land of questions. But our trust in God cannot rest on God over and over again proving his love and care for us. Why? Because trust is the necessary quality for an eternal relationship, and God knows this. In the final account of the lack of water causing a crisis of trust and the Exodus journey that's recorded in Numbers chapter 20, we see the necessity of trusting God and how God illustrates this, that he takes this momentary and seemingly minor lack of trust on Moses' part when Moses goes beyond the direction of God and strikes the rock, and Moses is not permitted to enter the promised land. Trusting in God is so vital to our relationship with God. Those who do not trust in Jesus as Savior and Lord, as far as we know, will not enter the promised land of heaven. Why? Because God and only God understands what it takes for an eternal relationship, and that is to trust in God. Even when signs of reassurance aren't coming, when we are filled with questions in the land between, to continue to trust in God and not have our trust in God rest on him continually showing us signs of his love and care. So here's the next step from today's sermon. Determine where you might be putting God to the test to prove to you that he's with you and working for your good. Spend some time thinking about that and listening to what God thinks about that, and determine whether this is helpful for you in your continuing trust of God. And if necessary, make a change in your thinking. May God continue to give us answers. But even when we don't have answers, may we continue to trust God in the land of questions. God be with you today.